Traveler, avert your eyes. Yelan is temporary, Ayato is forever.
What's up guys, Ayato has finally released and so far he's a wonderful addition for many teams in Genshin Impact. He treads the water as both a main DPS with solid damage and a sub DPS character with decent hydro application, making him a super valuable commodity right off the bat. As usual, I'm going to give you everything you need to know about how to build Ayato, from his best artifacts and weapons to general playstyles and preliminary team compositions. He's a pretty complicated character, so let's not waste any more time and get this guide rolling. There's a lot of small things that you need to understand about Ayato, especially when it comes to his elemental skill, so let me try to break things down as quickly and as digestible as possible. First things first, Ayato's main attraction is his elemental skill, which has him dash back and convert his normal attacks into hydro damage. The damage from the illusion that he creates is considered elemental skill damage, but the damage from his hydro attacks are considered normal attack damage. So our first takeaway is that we want to focus as much normal attack damage bonus as possible, whether it be through artifact sets or weapon passives. The base multiplier of these hydro attacks is also affected by leveling up his elemental skills talent level, so Ayato's talent priority will be his skill first, then his burst as high as possible after. Upgrading auto attacks are quite useless for Ayato, similar to the way that we focus talents for child if anyone watching is a child main. Aside from that, Ayato's skill is pretty straightforward. He has a buff called Namisen, which stacks by hitting opponents with his hydro attacks. He can get up to 4 Namisen stacks, and each stack will increase the damage dealt by his hydro attacks based on his max HP. This sounds really cool, but I want to emphasize that you don't want to focus HP on Ayato because it's simply not worth it over attack percent. Overall, the buff is pretty small, so you should view these Namisen stacks as a small bonus rather than a focal point of Ayato's kit. For Ayato's burst, I think it's a pretty strong tool to have. If you want a comparison, Ayato basically has Ganyu's burst. He deals waves of hydro damage in a radius, and instead of increasing cryo damage bonus of party members, he increases the normal attack damage bonus of party members within the radius. The damage multipliers of this skill look pretty small on paper, but the great thing about this ability is that it lasts for 18 seconds and only has a 20-second cooldown. That's some pretty insane burst uptime, and even though Ayato has an 80 energy cost burst, his second Ascension talent grants him 2 energy per second if he's lower than 40 energy, which makes his energy problem much less prevalent. And of course, before we move into artifacts, I'm sure the more serious players and theory crafters are probably concerned about the internal cooldown of Ayato's elemental skill and elemental burst. As expected, both the hydro attacks from his elemental skill and his elemental burst have the standard ICD of 2.5 seconds. Both his hydro attacks and elemental burst can attack at a pretty fast rate, so it's really no surprise that Hoyoverse stuck to the normal internal cooldown rules. I actually think that this internal cooldown is not a bad thing for Ayato, because this way he's not forced into one role, and players can have a little more flexibility when it comes to building Ayato as a sub DPS with his elemental burst, or building Ayato as a hyper carry that focuses mostly on his elemental skill. Moving into how to build Ayato, I want to start off with weapons first, because I think starting off with Ayato's weapons will make choosing his artifacts a much easier choice. I'll explain why that is when we get into the artifact section. Anyways, Ayato has quite a few weapon options, and in general, here's the order of all viable weapons, starting from the strongest weapons down to the more niche options. In the number 1 spot, it's no surprise that we have Ayato's signature weapon, Haran Geppaku Hutsu. This weapon really taps into Ayato's hyper carry playstyle with his elemental skill by granting a ton of normal attack damage bonus and even a little bit of elemental damage bonus. It's definitely a worthwhile weapon to pick up if you have a lot of primo gems to spare. Outside of Ayato's signature weapon, we have the Primordial Jade Cutter for a pretty clear second place weapon. This weapon is known for being really good on pretty much every sword character, and Ayato is no different. The great thing about this weapon, aside from the crit rate, is that the passive actually does give a little more damage to Ayato, because the extra HP percent is also used by his Namisen stacks. In the number 3 spot, we have the Mist Splitter Reforged. This weapon wraps up the holy trinity of crit weapons that we have for sword users, and its passive is pretty good for balanced damage because unlike Haran, it solely focuses on elemental damage rather than being mostly normal attack damage. Beyond the newly formed holy trinity of 5-star crit swords, I'm sure many other players are looking for other options because it can be kinda hard to get your hands on the swords that I've already listed. As expected, certain other 5-star swords like Scoured Blade and Summit Shaper are also great options for Ayato, but if you're strictly looking for 4-star weapons, your most consistent option is going to be the BP weapon, the Black Sword. This sword provides a nice balance of crit rate and normal attack damage bonus. Refinements are nice for this weapon, but the great thing about it is that the weapon already does a pretty good job at R1, meaning it's a great $10 investment. The other recommended 4-star swords that are also strong but sometimes not as consistent as the Black Sword are the Blackcliff Longsword, Lion's Roar, and Amanoa Kageuchi. Blackcliff Longsword really shines when the passive is fully stacked, but without the passive stacks, the weapon does have quite a noticeable damage drop-off. Lion's Roar is the exact same way, where if you're using an Electrocharge team, then Ayato loves this weapon. However, if you don't have the passive because you're not using an Electrocharge team, definitely try to stay away from this weapon. And last but not least, Amanoa Kageuchi is the completely free-to-play option for players to use. The weapon's damage is decent considering it's free to play, and the damage is also super consistent, but the only issue with the weapon is that the energy generation passive is hard to utilize to its full potential. This is because Ayato's elemental skill cooldown is not necessarily on the short side, meaning we won't be able to get all 3 seed stacks. And aside from that, that should wrap up the weapon section, so choose your best option from the ones I just listed, and let's move into the artifact section where you'll pick an artifact set based on what weapon you decide to run on Ayato. For Ayato's artifacts, we have 2 main artifact sets that you want to focus. The choice can be a little difficult for indecisive players, but I'll do my best to lay out the scenarios that help you pick one of these sets over the other. To begin things, the main consensus on Ayato's artifacts is that there's no universal best in slot. Instead, the 2 artifact sets that are neck and neck in terms of damage are the 4-set Heart of Depth and the new 4-set Echoes of an Offering. In general, if you have a weapon that grants a ton of damage bonuses like Elemental Damage Bonus or Normal Attack Damage Bonus, then the 4-set Echoes of an Offering is the set that you want to go. In specific terms, that means if you're using Haran Geppaku Hutsu, Mistsplitter Reforged, the Black Sword, or Lion's Roar, then you should focus on farming the new artifact set. If you're running any other sword that doesn't really give damage bonuses, then typically the 4-set Heart of Depth is the better option because of its consistency and more balanced damage. There's a whole ton of math that goes behind this reasoning, but I know there's a lot of people who don't want to spend too much time worrying about that. If you really don't care about the optimization, then choose whichever set you like better between the 4-set Heart of Depth and the 4-set Echoes of an Offering. The bottom line is that you can't go wrong with either of these options. So for my theory crafters, I'll just briefly say that the extra flat damage provided by the 4-set Echoes of an Offering benefits from existing damage bonus buffs. This includes the passives from weapons such as Haran or Mistsplitter. On the other hand, if you have a weapon such as Primordial Jade Cutter or Amanoa Kageuchi that only provides extra attack, then it's better to stock up on other sources of damage bonuses, such as the bonuses provided by the 4-set Heart of Depth. If you want a slightly more in-depth version of what flat damage is and how it works, you can check out a deeper explanation in my Yunjin guide up to the top right or in the description below. Anyways, back to normal people talk. If you don't have either the 4-set Echoes of an Offering or the 4-set Heart of Depth, then you're going to need a placeholder set until you can farm a good enough 4-set for Ayato. In general, the 2 placeholders I'd recommend the most are the 4-set Gladiator or the 2-set Heart of Depth with any set that gives 18% attack. The set that goes along with the 2-set Heart of Depth could be the 2-set Gladiator, 2-set Shimenawa's Reminiscence, 2-set Echoes of an Offering, or even the 2-set Vermilion Hereafter. Choose whichever combination gives you the best artifact substats because ultimately your substats are what turns your character from good to great. And last but not least, we've reached the tail end of the guide where I'll cover some of Ayato's strongest teams upon his release. Given that Ayato is a Hydro character with a long-lasting AoE Hydro Burst, it should be no surprise that there are a ton of teams going around right now. But if you don't know where to start, I'll be listing my top 3 teams for Ayato based on preliminary testing and a little bit of personal preference as well. Feel free to comment your favorite Ayato team down below if you don't see it listed here. Starting off with the first team, we feature a Hyper Carry Ayato. This team is probably going to be the most popular team on release because it uses Ayato as the main DPS and surrounds him with 3 universal supports to maximize the overall team damage. These 3 supports that go along with Ayato are Bennett, Kazuha, and Fischl. Bennett and Kazuha are pretty self-explanatory when it comes to supporting the team because they're used pretty much everywhere, but Fischl is here because she synergizes well with Ayato's fast attacking playstyle, especially with Fischl C6. Electrocharge is a very popular reaction right now, and it's a great way to squeeze out extra damage in Ayato's rotation. Raiden Shogun is a more expensive replacement for Fischl, but she provides some nice benefits to the team. Now, Ayato's elemental skill downtime can be filled in by Raiden Shogun's elemental burst. As such, in this variation, Ayato is not necessarily the hypercarry now that Raiden can also fill that role. Also, if you don't have Kazuha because he is a 5-star that hasn't been on a banner for a while, then Sucrose is the next best Anemo support because she can increase your elemental mastery to get better damage out of the Electrocharge reaction. For our second team, of course, we have the Kamisato sibling team. Here, Ayato fully embraces the sub-DPS playstyle to support his sister Ayaka with the freeze reaction. Aside from Ayato and Ayaka, the other two characters should be a cryo support and an Anemo support. 99% of the time, your cryo support is going to be Diona because of her healing and shielding. However, if you have an Anemo healer, then other characters like Rosaria and Shenhe can be used to buff Ayaka even further. The Anemo character is pretty flexible since all we really need is the 4-cent Viridescent Veneerer. However, the two most popular options for this sibling team are Venti or Kazuha. As mentioned before, healers like Jean and Sayu are underrated options because they allow you to run an offensive cryo support like Rosaria or Shenhe instead of Diona. For our third and final team, it's actually quite similar to the Kamisato sibling team because it's also a freeze team. However, the theory crafting behind this team is actually completely different. Rather, this team is very similar to the Morgana team, which has been a popular freeze team for a long time now. This team is exactly like the original Morgana team, except we replace Mona with Ayato. This gives us Ayato, Ganyu, Diona, and Venti. Because Ayato has an elemental burst similar to Ganyu, we can take this quadratic scaling to the maximum and abuse grouping enemies together. The premise of this team is to group enemies together with Venti and get a ton of AoE damage against the grouped enemies with both Ayato and Ganyu's bursts. I have yet to test this team much outside of preliminary tests, but I definitely have high hopes for the pairing of Ayato, Ganyu, and Venti. So far, Ayato has been a nice addition to Genshin, and I know there are a lot of players who will appreciate both his character design and his swift animation / playstyle. But besides that, that's all I have time for today. Good luck to everyone pulling for Ayato, and if you enjoyed this guide, be sure to support both the video and the channel. You can follow me on Twitch, join my Discord, sub to the YouTube channel, or whatever people do nowadays. Other than that, it's the same as always. I'll see y'all in the next one. Peace.